Okay, so I'm going to talk about testimonialism. And a little history on Propertarianism is that it began as an exploration into a shift in democratic media strategy to talking points in the 90s, and a search to find a way of defending against that, which talking points and ignoring debate is a form of lying. So it became a pursuit of truth testing. So testimonialism, I think, is one of the core and initial innovations of Propertarianism, to which all of the other things we've discussed so far are a product of this process. Now, so far I've talked about a number of things, from property to trust as a property, which we would call it a commons, high trust commons. We've talked about reciprocity, how all of these have spun out of a thing called acquisitionalism, which is the video on asymmetrical benefit, which then ties into 3 modes of moving the world, which are actually survival strategies. So I'm at a point here where all of these start to converge. It's one thing to discuss them and see how they're related to each other in a network of concepts. Network of relationships or relations. This is where we see them converging. I'll try to explain a little bit about how testimonialism stems out of a number of those things. The first thing I'd like you to consider is, think of all the things you know and how you know them, not in a sense of epistemology, but the vast majority of knowledge of the world that we have, we gain from others. We learn it from teachers in school. We learn it from parents. We read it in books. We see it on movies or documentaries. All of that falls under a category of testimony. So I think intuitively we think of testimony as something that happens in a court or that gets referenced in the Bible, when really we're swimming in a sea of testimony. The vast majority of what you know in the world has come through the form of testimony. So testimonialism is around clarifying and adding rigor and accountability into the primary means in which individuals gain the information they need to survive, which is testimony. We've talked a little bit about truth and knowledge, and that knowledge is the warrant, obtaining enough warrant to suspend doubt enough to act with confidence. And the notion that warrant for knowledge should be a strict and robust criteria. The greater or the strength of your warrant, the greater the greater degree in which we suspend doubt with confidence. Okay. So set that aside for a moment and then think of this. When I talked about in E prime about, or even in what is truth, that truth is a property of a sentence, and it's the property of it being tested for true or false. I want you to expand that for a second and consider this. A sentence is not true or false, but a speaker speaks truthfully or speaks in error. So when we're testing, we're not testing the sentence. We're not testing the linguistic artifact. We're testing the speaker who's uttered it. So let that sink in for a minute. Statements are not true or false. Speakers either speak truthfully or they lie. All right, so testimonialism is a means of measuring truthfulness, and does so by a strict criteria of warrant. So let's expand the notion of true as the ability of measuring a speech utterance for its ability to be falsified, and extend that the primary concern here isn't really true or false, but is it truthful or not? Does the speaker speak truthfully? So this brings in sort of a moral component to testimonialism, which then ties back into reciprocity. And then how that ties back into reciprocity is that information, the body of human knowledge, is a property. It's a commons. It's a shared property. And if we lie or speak in error or get things wrong, we're polluting the information commons. And then that imposes costs on other people to correct the record or to correct you, or imposes costs in that they act on incorrect or incomplete information. So it increases the likelihood that they'll fail in their endeavors. So in other words, it gives them false confidence when they're suspending doubt to act. Okay, so it's really, it's about eliminating these costs so that when we speak, and speaking is this transaction, that the transaction is reciprocal. If it's not reciprocal, we spiral into retaliation and conflict. So then that ties back into survival strategies, that if we're compromising reciprocity, we're compromising our survivability. So testimonialism is a big and robust thing, and I'll do my best to cover this over, but it by no means will be comprehensive. But I just wanted to highlight that there are these overlaps from an ethical standpoint, which is reciprocity, into property, which is a means of calculating costs and benefits, which is actually an extension of our agency, and specifically the incentive to increase our agency goes back to our survivability, which then spins back around to reciprocity. Start to get an idea that all of these things are tightly interwoven. So just very quickly, testimony is a long list of criteria to establish if a statement or what a speaker utters is a truth candidate. So we don't say that you arrive at a truth as in a positive sense, that we've created truth or created a truthful statement. What we say is that we've created a statement that suspends doubt enough that we can act with confidence. That, in other words, it's a truth candidate that has survived falsifiability. It survives falsifiability. So testimonialism ends up being a means of falsifying the statement. Okay. All right, so here is a long list, and this, like anything with knowledge that's provisional, it does get updated and changed. I've broken this out into 3 groups because they cover off certain domains, and depending on the claims that we're making, some will take precedence over others. And then I've added an additional one in that has come up and out of this list over time, but it's important to consider as well. Okay, we begin in testimonialism very similar to what you would find in most intro to philosophy classes, or if you're familiar with the trivium, the notion of grammar, logic, and rhetoric as it's applied to epistemology. So our first 3 criteria, we look at differences or categorical consistency. So do we have the right reference, the identities, the things in which we're talking about? Do they fit the categories that we claim they belong to? And are they discrete, or are we mixing things together? The notion of conflation, that we're taking 2 separate entities and we're colliding them together so that we can make an assertion about one thing that isn't actually related to it. So the first criteria is about identity. And in the trivium, that would be sort of the equivalent to grammar. Do you have all of your definitions proper? So you could think of that criteria 1 as definitions or identity. Is it categorically consistent? The next one pertains to logic, which is internal consistency. Does how you're organizing those identities, is it non-contradictory and consistent? So this is the logic in your regular philosophical context. And then the third one is external correspondence, which is there evidence of this in the world? Does it correspond with the world? So even if we're making a meaningful statement or a coherent statement, we still need to account for, does this actually occur in the world? Do we have evidence for it? Is it observable? So those three together in a regular philosophical context is what we call sound and valid. So you can find a ton of that on the internet. So the next thing I would like to say is that these three are considered essentially the hallmark of truth statements in Normie land, in the rest of the world. That this is what defines proper epistemology, are these three things. And you can see that the criteria that we're using is considerably larger than just these three things. And there's good reason for that. The first one, which the next one that we get into, I think is a critical one, which is operational construction. This is to say that how we connect the logic in how we're organizing those ideas or those entities, what should connect the logic to the identities is the operations of those identities. And there's two ways of looking at operations. Is that thing that I'm referring to, how does it operate? What are its effects? So if you go through the E prime video, we talk about existence and effects. So what are the effects, and are those effects accounted for in the logic? Or are we just superimposing a set of causal relations on top of the identity? We can claim that that one thing accounts for a particular outcome, but unless we can account for how it operates to result in that outcome, then we can be interpreting rather than actually observing within the concept. So operational construction, if the way that you're saying that something operates, what its effects are and how it operates in the world isn't possible, let me say it's not existentially possible. So operational construction is actually to say, is it existentially consistent? Do what we observe in the world, external correspondence, and how those interactions between those identities create certain effects, internal consistency, across the identities that we're referring to. So operationalism ends up being the glue between identity, internal consistency, which is our interpretation of what's going on with the identities, and the facts of the matter. Okay, so operationalism, it's a bigger topic, and it's really the glue of a lot of these other criteria. It helps bring coherence across those other three criteria. The other way that you can look at operationalism is, as Brigman was the one that began operationalism. He said that we'll have one word for a concept, but that the concept at different scales, you really can't compare them. There isn't commensurability between human scale and, say, interstellar scale. So for instance, if we take length, and I take a tape measure and I measure my dining room table, there's a set of operations that I do to measure that table, from stretching out a tape measure, and then there's an arbitrarily decided unit that we all share called inches or centimeters, and then I count them off. And then the total amount that I count off is the length of that table. That's a set of things that you do to measure, or a set of operations. Well, when we talk about the distance between stars, we can imagine it kind of like a super huge tape measure, but we actually don't count off increments of space. We count off the length of time it takes for light to travel between the two. So it has this temporal component to it, and speed. So it's speed and time. It's not length. But we consider both of these things, distance, to be the same thing. And that conflation, so we're talking about identity now, it's a conflation of two different identities, because we're superlaying or superimposing human intuitions, which happen at human scale, onto something outside of our scale, outside of human scale. So that can be going from human scale to the very big, or human scale to the very small. And what Brigman asserted is that quantum mechanics would not have been a shock. It would have been a logical outcome of earlier science if this conflation of scales wasn't occurring, and that his solution for that was operationalism, which is to define a concept by the operations of which we measure it. Okay, so this ties back into what I was saying about existence is to have effects. That's in the E prime video. And the effects that an object has upon you is how we then know it exists. Well, we experience it through our senses. So I want you to consider that our senses are really nothing more than a means of measuring the world. They're a means of detection and measurement. So when we're describing the appearance of an object, or we're describing how it behaves, we are actually defining the concept, if we're defining it operationally, in the context of how we are measuring it, how we are observing it. So how we find coherence between internal consistency, which is the coherent part of truth theories, to external correspondence is those operations and those observations. Okay. I'm going to skip over 5 and 6 for a minute, because they are more relevant in a very specific domain of assertions. The next thing that comes in with most logical arguments, most schools of thought around epistemology, will be the notion of parsimony. Some people would be familiar with that through Occam Razor, but the proper, or I think the most effective way of understanding parsimony is to say that your argument has everything that's necessary within it, so you're not missing something, but only what's sufficient, so that you're not overloading it. And this is an often overlooked means of lying, is that people will inundate you with evidence, or inundate you with logic. So you have to ask yourself, was that sufficient enough to explain the operation? And if not, it's the fallacy of argumentation ad nauseum. Overloading people is a way of lowering their defenses so that you can lie to them. You can seek opportunities for irreciprocity or non-reciprocal transactions. We can overload through emotion, appeals to emotion. We can overload through the senses, like appeals to vividness, like showing dead children on a beach. Or we can overload with an incredible amount of data that is claimed to be fact and evidence, when how it is framed as fact or evidence could be completely incorrect. So a way of covering over how that data relates as a fact. If there's an error in the logic, you can hide that error in the logic by just throwing a ton of evidence at somebody. That's breaking parsimony in the sense that it's providing more than what's sufficient for your argument. So parsimony is everything that's necessary and only what's sufficient. And I jumped parsimony here because limits, completeness, and limits and completion, 7 and 8 in here, can be considered a part of parsimony. To have everything that's necessary, you need to understand the completeness of your argument, and only what's sufficient means you need to know where the limits are. And limits and completeness relate back to operationalism in that a set of constant relations between operations, which I'll eventually get to a video on that, has a point in which it begins, where that relationship coheres, and then it goes through a series of changes until the conditions for that relationship then break apart. So the operations occur within a set of limits, where they begin and where they end. And then within that, we'll have a spectrum or a series that accounts for a number of identities, which are states within that spectrum, that is actually one identity within a set of changes. So where the changes begin, where it comes into being, and where it ceases to be are the limits. And then we have these transformations through the middle. So really what operational language and E prime and testimonial, this first part of testimonialism is that if there's a topic that you're going to make an assertion on or try to understand, you need to pull it out of the particular context in which it's occurring into an existential context, meaning how it exists, into an operational context. And then by doing that, you understand what is driving the changes and where the limits are. And that the particular context that you are focusing on ends up being a single point on a spectrum. It's one location within a series. And then once you understand that, you don't fall into the problem of arguing false dichotomies. And you can account for how it changes, how that state point changes from one state to the next. So now you have another set of limits. So when you move into the particular context, that particular context is a set of limits for that particular state, which is occurring within a set of operations that have a broader series within its limits. So operationalism starts to inform limits and completeness. And parsimony, and it also informs parsimony, only what's necessary and only what's sufficient. Okay, now I'm going to jump up to 5 now and say that 5 and 6 are predominantly relevant when we're talking about sociology, or the interactions specifically with 5, the interactions between agents. And really what we're saying, we have to account for rational choice or incentives. So if we're making a claim about a particular group behaving a particular way that has a particular outcome, when that particular group acts a certain way, it acts according to a set of incentives. So rational choice really comes down to, are those choices they're making, are those incentives real or not? Because we can make up incentives. We can say that, well, for instance, with patriarchy or whiteness theory, there's a set of assumed incentives that white people are following that is based on bigotry and preserving privilege, as opposed to everybody, not just white people, seeking to reduce social frictions in times of stress, which accounts for all of those same causes that they're talking about, or those effects that they're talking about. So rational choice is really about, are these incentives real? Are these choices that people really make? Or if you're talking about any other type of agent, is the agent responding to these incentives? The next one, number 6, is reciprocal choice. So this is how testimonialism now ties back into, obviously, reciprocity, but back into a sort of a moral foundation. Is what the person's proposing limited within reciprocal relationships? In other words, are they gaming an argument to seek an opportunity to do damages or to steal? Are they accounting for a clear transaction in the informational transaction? is what they are proposing to you moral? So that becomes a criteria under a certain set of circumstances based on the assertion that you're making. So if somebody gives you a long argument as to say, gives you a long argument about climate change as a justification for sort of authoritarian or totalitarian control over human behavior in the name of climate change, what they're proposing breaks reciprocity, right? So if they're proposing a change in human behavior and the use of authoritarian control, they have to account for that lack of reciprocity. In that particular case, they don't. So further to that, now we're talking about more of a moral equation. The next thing is when somebody is proposing a set of actions or is proposing a set of changes, or they're speaking impactfully to the public. So if it's an expert claiming something is the way it is, or they're giving governmental advice on changing policy, is the speaker able to warrant or ensure the damages they cost that would be incurred if they were wrong? Okay, so that's the notion of, say you and I get into a contract and I say to you, lend me $25,000 to invest in my business. And I am not able, I have no means at that moment to know if I can ever pay that $25,000 back to you. I'm not warranting the downside of that transaction. I'm not insuring the downside of that transaction. So this is one other criteria in terms of testimonialism, in terms of legal or political domains, is if they're saying something that is potentially damaging, if they're wrong in what they're saying, can they insure against that? Can they warranty it? So because we have two different things going on with warranty here. Warranty is the due diligence behind your whole argument, but now here is warranty more in the colloquial sense. Is can they insure against the damages that would be caused if they spoke in error? Okay. So now let's look at this whole thing. We're talking about, in one hand, 1 through 4 and 7 through 10. We're talking about a robust criteria to warrant a claim to knowledge. In other words, to warrant a truth claim, it becomes a truth candidate in which we can suspend doubt enough to act in confidence, but also to act in confidence against the outcome or the results of that speech, which is covered off in 5 and 6. So we're coming out of just the context of making an argument, but we're coming into the domain of transactions and costs within a property. Right? So there's elements in here that is doing due diligence, not only against whether your claim is falsifiable or not, but also to ensure against potential damages if you float this within the property of informational commons. Are you making an investment into those commons, or are you committing a vandalism against those commons? So we have reciprocity in there. We have warranty in terms of truth. We have warranty in terms of insuring property. We have the notion of truth and trustworthiness. It would be a beneficial shift in thinking to move our thinking from truth, as in true, false, into trustworthy or not. And remember, with trust, we're talking about not only sincerity, but also reliability. And that if you are able to pass all of these tests, these 1 through 10 tests, you can with confidence say that you do not lie, that you are not in error, given the information at hand, that you are proving that you are not committing a deceit or a theft in which you say, and by meeting all of that criteria, you're demonstrating that you've done the due diligence behind what you're speaking. And by demonstrating the due diligence behind what you're speaking, then you can claim it as a truth candidate. You could be speaking something correctly without ever doing the due diligence. And in doing that, you're not demonstrating due diligence to that other person. It shifts the cost of due diligence from you, the speaker, to them, the listener, to verify if what you're saying is correct or not. So it's imposing a cost on the other person. It's a non-reciprocal transaction. So by giving this due diligence to the other person, and essentially the transaction is, I will give you this information for your buy-in, for a change of your mind. Here is my offer to you. I'm paying for it with due diligence for you to vet and digest on your own and then agree with me. Right? So if you do this due diligence and the other person is rejecting it, then there is probably something under rational choice within their incentives as to why they're rejecting it. So that generally falls into a category of them seeking opportunity for non-reciprocity. This is quite often why you find people that are more adept with P, they'll get into debates, and then at some point it'll shift from the topic at hand to the incentives of that other person. It's not to say you don't agree with me, you're wrong. It's to say I have now identified an incentive that you're acting off of, which is relevant to your rebuttal. So for instance, some people will prize idealism or aesthetics over empiricism, say one is primary over the other, or that the primacy of language supersedes empiricism. So first there's language and then there's reality. And you can see that and say, well, by doing that, you're creating the opportunity to lie. And that empiricism in checking external correspondence and operational construction is the way that we test against your language to ensure that you're not lying. So if you're trying to remove that criteria by saying there's a primacy of linguistics, then you're seeking to secure, whether you intend to or not, you're working towards securing an opportunity to lie. So this might give some insight as to why sometimes we can be assholes. Let me just check my notes for a second here. Right. So this is this lends itself to one of the primary solutions we're trying to solve in our society right now. We're going through a number, all across the Western world, a number of divisiveness, divisions across different groups, different incentives, different temperaments. It's all over the place, between genders, between races, between political orientations. And that the majority of those divisions can be traced back to either media or academia lying. So the notion of free speech has secured the opportunity to use lies to move the world. It's a means of parasitism. And the testimonialism is to say, you're free to speak, but only speak truthfully to the public. And I'm hoping that you can see, by having a robust criteria like that, we can eliminate the damages that we're seeing to our social fabric that's going on right now, because disparate groups are competing politically for special rights and for advantage. And in doing that, in their short-term sight to gain advantage and gain special rights, they're devouring the generations of social capital, in other words, high trust commons, that have been built up by our ancestors. They're burning the house down, and this is the fire hose to put it out.